I think that cost can be obviously a factor when you are trying to design a high performance building, a sustainable building. And there are strategies related to sustainability that may cost more. Um, However, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more. The earlier we can get involved and integrate like sustainability into the conceptual design of a project or the early design of a project, the most cost efficient it can be.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. Most Modern. My name's Minku. I'm here with Alex and Lebo. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Irmak Turan. She leads the Sustainability and Resilience team in Thornton Tomasetti's Boston office, and she completed her PhD at MIT Building Technology. Please welcome Irmak, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Irmak, so you started your career as an architect specializing in environmental design and went into the field of building science. And now you're leading a group of sustainability and resilience team. It sounds like a natural progression, but can you tell us a little more about your early career journey?
Sure. My career progression has has been a little meandering. I wouldn't say I necessarily lead a building science team. I am in the sustainability and resilience group. So we're really focused on environmental performance, building technology, sustainability, which are all, it seems like, buzzwords. So we can talk about what some of these mean. But I can tell you a little bit about my background first. So I did study architecture and civil engineering as an undergrad. And so I have like a educational background in architecture and design. I never practiced as an architect in the direct sense. I After college, I worked as a sustainability consultant at an engineering firm, and then transitioned to working as a sort of a sustainability advisor in various architecture firms. So I've been in the architecture firm context, but always as sort of the environmental performance, sustainability voice in the room. So I let's see. After college, I worked for about 4 years as a in the sustainability consulting world. I was in New York at first, and then I moved to Istanbul, and I worked there for a while. And then decided that I really wanted to dive deeper into some aspects of environmental performance of buildings and the built environment. That's what led me to go back to graduate school. I started at MIT, um, first doing a master's, in which I was interested in sort of in the idea of urban metabolism in the sense of like material reuse, building reuse within a urban context. So that was my focus in my master's, and then I continued on in the PhD and was really interested in and studied the impact of environmental aspects of the buildings on the financial sort of returns of buildings. And so my PhD was focused on the financial value of daylight and views. Um, so I chose to go to graduate school as as a way to, like I said, dive deeper and understand some of the forces that drive sort of the sustainability of buildings. Um, that I was in academia for a while, teaching and doing research, and really loving that environment, but also missing sort of the applied um, work and really being able to take that knowledge and apply it to buildings that are getting designed, constructed, permitted, everything that's happening in the world, where you know, at the in a year or two, you see the progress of a project move forward, and seeing that impact happening at a maybe like shorter scale time scale than you do when you're in the more academic research side. And so since returning to the practicing world, which I did about 2 years ago. I've been working, as you said, Minku, as a sustainability consultant at Thornton Tomasetti, and our practice, the sustainability and resilience team, really consults on building projects on a wide range of things related to energy, decarbonization, sustainability, resilience. It's wide, it has a wide breadth of that it captures.
Yeah, so you mentioned all these different buzzwords, and obviously, I would imagine that the course of your career has also aligned with this influx of attention paid to sustainability and resiliency. Can you give our audience a quick definition of what sustainability or resiliency, or to combine, means when it relates to the built environment?
Sure. So sustainability, I liked. I might be I might be distinguishing it too definitively, but I like to think of sustainability as almost like, if we're thinking about it in terms of like climate change, it's like the mitigation part of climate change. So we're talking about how to make buildings be less of a burden on the planet and the planet's resources. So how do we improve our energy efficiency? How do we reduce the amount of embodied carbon in a building? How do we reduce the ecological footprint of buildings? Resiliency is sort of the other end of our approach to climate change, if we're in that context, in that it's looking at adaptation methods, looking at how the built environment responds to environmental events, or climate events, weather events, things that happen to the building that are sort of uh, a result of sort of the changing world.
And do you
And they
often?
often they are I while I make that distinction, there is overlap. Like when we look at for example, decarbonization projects, we're looking at, especially when we work with clients who have, like, whether it be a campus with lots of buildings or a developer with a large portfolio of buildings, we're looking at how do we make the buildings more energy efficient and reduce their carbon emissions, but then at the same time, that's very integrally tied into how do we build up their resilience, so when extreme weather events happen, when flooding happens, they are, they can withstand those events. So they do sort of meld together really naturally.
So Thornton Tomasetti is an engineering firm, from my knowledge, and the work that you are leading, it sounds like there's a lot of overlap, or it needs a lot of interaction with the architecture design team. How does that relationship work, and in terms of teamwork wise, and also in terms of process wise?
Yeah, there is a integral sort of relationship with the architecture team, and we work very closely with architects all the time. You're right. Thornton Tomasetti is an engineering firm. It's a large engineering firm with lots of different practices. It started as a structural engineering firm, but it has a really it has a wealth of various practices that touch different parts of the built environment. So sustainability and resilience is one small practice. We're on the smaller side in terms of the practices. Um, and our role as consultants on a project is to be the voice at the table that sort of both helps to provide expertise in the area of environmental performance, sustainability, resilience, and then but also work very closely with like building owners, architects, the designers, to design in a way that meets certain environmental goals or responds to certain environmental conditions. And so we will be, ideally, we're on projects from the very beginning, And so as the project is being conceptualized, like in early concept or even pre-concept, when they're establishing like what are the goals for the project, if there are environmental goals or sustainability and resilience goals, hopefully those are sort of included in the initial sort of conceptualization of what's driving a project. And so we will help the team to develop what some of those goals could be, how those could be measured, like what are the different metrics and ways of evaluating a sustainability or resilience goal. And then as the project develops and goes through the various phases, use appropriate analysis tools to evaluate, like, are we actually meeting the goal, or is the project on track to sort of achieving what was set out at the beginning? And the tools that are used at different phases will change depending on how developed a design is. I'm speaking like in the context of a new construction in this case, like as opposed to say like some of the existing building work that we do.
So when you talk about some of these goals, like how are these goals set by either the owner or the architect, and what are some of the ways that or tools that you use to evaluate against these goals?
So the goals that we set at the beginning of a project can come from a number of can develop in a number of different ways. More and more, we're seeing that they're actually requirements as part of like code or municipal zoning regulations. So in some cases, they don't have a choice. And so, I could give the example of in Massachusetts, they just changed the energy code as of last year. They updated it and to be quite ambitious, actually. And so the Massachusetts Stretch Energy Code, which has been adopted by over 90% of the state, requires a certain level of energy performance. And so any project in a municipality that has committed to this stretch code is required to meet those goals. And so in some cases, we're just helping the clients and the project teams navigate that process, saying like, this is what the code requires. These are new and like more ambitious goals than we've had in the past. How can we go about like meeting it? So some of the goals, like I said, come from regulations or policy. In other cases, it might be that like I said, institutions have set their own requirements, and they say, like, as an institution, like a lot of higher ed institutions have a carbon, like an emissions reduction goal by say 2030 or 2050. So for the entire, all of their buildings, they've said we want to decarbonize. And so we say, okay, on this particular project, what does that mean? And how do we contribute to this larger institutional goal? And so we'll help to set a carbon emissions reduction target. So sometimes it's led that way. And then in other cases, we'll have a client who is really motivated to do better by their buildings. Like they're building a new building or they're renovating, and they know they want it to be sustainable, but they don't quite know what that means. And so then we will sort of present options to them and say, so what does sustainability mean to you? And we do this often with like early design charrettes or workshops where we listen to them more than we sort of tell them what they want. Like when you think of sustainability, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about the health and well-being of the people in the building? Are you thinking about energy usage? Are you thinking about the site? Are you thinking about materials and resources, and or like sustainable education of the people, of the users? And through those conversations, we start to develop frameworks saying, okay, these seem to be the areas that are of importance. And so now how do we'll start to say, like, what does sustainability mean in those areas? And we can present like metrics or ways of sort of evaluating sustainability in those particular areas that will help to then hone in on goals that are appropriate for a project.
So it seems like you're saying that there's a diversity of ways that we can measure sustainability, yet maybe from the policy side, it's more about carbon impact and carbon emissions. Is that true? Like in terms of there's a sort of large scale unit which we need to reduce, which is just general carbon impact. But then there's all these other ways that actually sustainability can be interpreted. So if that's the case, how do we balance between the two? Because it seems like there needs to be some sort of currency. At the same time, every project is different.
Yeah, so it's interesting you asked that question, because I feel like it's been coming up more and more, where the codes and the policies have been very focused on carbon emissions, because that's what is causing climate change at its heart, and that's how buildings are are attributed to 40% of carbon emissions. And so there's a huge, if we can decarbonize our buildings, make them more energy efficient, we will significantly improve the trajectory for climate change, by reduce the human generated carbon emissions that are contributing to the changing climate. For that reason, policies and codes have been very focused on that, and you can tie that back to like the Paris Agreement and larger sort of policy frameworks that the state, or the country, the states, the cities have been sort of responding to. But as you said, Alex, sustainability is responding to sort of the climate situation in terms of emissions, but it's also all these other aspects of how buildings impact the environment or use resources. So I would say that energy efficiency and the associated carbon emissions are one aspect of sustainability, but certainly not the only aspect of sustainability. It is very important that we address energy and carbon in buildings. But sustainability also includes, the materials in the building, whether it be, like the toxicity of materials and the potential hazards that they create when they're installed in buildings or in their production, like how are materials made and what are the potential environmental hazards of the production and the implementation of those materials. There's also that's related also to the health and well-being of people inside buildings. And with COVID, that was accentuated. We became sort of a commonplace sort of knowledge to the general public, which is air quality in buildings is super important. We want fresh air in our buildings, and we spend most of our time inside spaces. And how is the air in those spaces? How are the other aspects of the building impacting us physiologically, psychologically, our mental health, our physical health? Sustainability is also like site issues. So it's not just what's happening inside the building, but what is happening outside the building on a site, like stormwater management, like the kinds of vegetation that's being used, how we're treating the grounds of a site. And so sustainability is really sort of a holistic umbrella for a lot of different topics. Decarbonization or energy and carbon is sort of one of the topics within that larger umbrella.
So I have a related question, which is the related measurable standards that exist in the sustainability realm. I mean, there are LEEDs, there are wellness scores, there's a passive house. There are all sorts of different, let's say, licenses that you can achieve by getting a certain score. But I question what defines what's better for a building. Like, is it better to take on the passive house approach, or would it be beneficial to get on the wellness approach? How does clients define that from your experience?
That's a great question. And it changes from project to project. It's really dependent on what is motivating a client or what the requirements are. Because just as energy efficiency requirements are becoming now part of codes and regulations, so in some cases, so are certain certifications. So, for example, in some communities, there is a minimum. In order to pass the zoning regulations, you have to have a minimum meet a minimum LEED certification requirement, or even if you don't fully certify buildings, you have to at least meet all the criteria, and so sort of design towards it, even if you're not getting the official certification. Certifications, I think, are extremely valuable because they are established frameworks that address different aspects of sustainability. So we were talking earlier about how you establish goals for a project. Not every client has the bandwidth, the resources, the time to be sitting in multiple workshops, talking through all the different aspects of sustainability and determining exactly what they want to do. In a lot of cases, a client, they're being pulled in lots of different directions. And they say, we just want to be sustainable. And so the certifications provide the framework in which they can say, okay, if we do LEED to a certain level, we feel like we're meeting our goals, our sustainability goals. Or as you're suggesting, Minku, like maybe there's a project that is they're really focused on the health and well-being of the people inside the building, their users. And then they might choose to go with, say, WELL certification, which is a certification that specifically focuses on health and well-being in buildings. So I think it's dependent on different factors for different clients, like what is their need and what aspects of sustainability are really driving them. Mm-hmm. So I'd say there is value to all of the certifications, and they apply to different projects depending on what the context is.
Yeah, what fascinates me related to the sustainability and resilience part is the area of measurement. Like, you can statistically understand the building. So coming back to your studies at MIT at the building science.
The program that I did in graduate school was the building technology program at MIT. And that program is very focused on, as you're suggesting, like understanding through analytical means and quantitative methods how buildings perform, how they operate, how they work. And, because it's the research aspect of that is like basically trying to trailblaze into new methods of developing analysis tools. like
I
developing
see.
new ways of understanding how buildings perform, or using the existing ones to understand like new information about buildings. So that doing that program, and the knowledge I gained through that experience was really having a strong understanding of what the analysis tools are, how they work, and what they can tell us, how, like how they could be applied. um I use those tools every day now in the work that I'm doing.
Wow.
So we, I think the difference for me in my experience was, you're in that world when you're doing like graduate research, you're really digging deep into like one topic. You go very deep into it. When in the role that I'm in now, which is in a consulting role, we're not diving necessarily quite as deep, but we're taking all of those tools, all of those concepts and approaches to building performance and applying them in like an agile way to different projects. So, for example, I mentioned my PhD research was on the value of daylight and views and how it affects finance, or how it affects the financial picture for office spaces. Now we do daylight analyses on projects, so I apply the same methods to understand daylight in a particular project as it's being developed or designed. And I can lean on the research that I did to give the client like a larger understanding of like, what does this mean for the building? Like, is it going to attract tenants? How, is it going to be something that the occupants value? And so being able to talk to that is, as I think, especially is has been a value to me, like as I'm practicing.
Well,
So
that's
yeah.
a fascinating research. Can you tell us the result at least? What did you find out?
Yeah, so I when I was doing my PhD, my interest was really to understand how we study environmental performance. That was like my world at in graduate school. I wanted to understand how all that environmental performance translates into financial value in buildings, because at the end of the day, the bottom line really drives a lot of what is designed and developed. So my research was focused on, or the critical question I asked was, what is the value of daylight and views in office spaces? And I was specifically looking at office spaces in New York. And I was evaluating how daylight and view performance in these spaces actually affected the rental value of these spaces. What I found was that it does indeed have an impact. So daylight and views, when it's better in an office space, it affects the rental value, the lease price of those office spaces by 5 to 6%. And that was using real data, so like fully executed lease data for hundreds of office spaces across New York. That was pre-COVID. I think that post-COVID it would be even higher. That would be my guess.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was to just connect sort of the financial real estate world with the building performance world.
Is that a contradiction though? Because we have a lot of regulations that actually restrict the amount of glazing on buildings, because if there's more windows, it's actually harder. Energy transfer and heat and cold air get in more easily. So are you saying that, how do you then balance against that? Because from the kind of occupancy standpoint, we want more windows. Obviously, we want to be able to see outside and be connected to the outside world. But on the other side, the envelope side, we also need to make sure that these facades and these windows are energy efficient. Is that something that you
Sure.
can then kind of build upon, or how does the research then inform policy or inform other codes?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because as you're saying, Alex, when you have a lot of glazing, you reduce your building envelope is less efficient. So it's less thermally efficient, meaning you're losing a lot of heat in one direction or the other through the building, which means you either have to heat it more or cool it more. So it's going to impact the energy performance of the building. And now there's a lot of places, a lot of municipalities or states are starting to put limits on how much glazing you can have, because they're trying to improve the thermal performance of the buildings. The thing is, we have gotten to this like extreme point where there's this desire to have like floor to ceiling glazing in any office space to make it somehow like attractive to tenants. I'm speaking specifically about office spaces.
Mm-hmm.
We know from daylighting research that you do not need floor to ceiling glazing in order to have optimal daylight levels in a space. So maybe from a aesthetic view standpoint, there is value in that it feels super open and you have these incredible expansive views. But from a daylighting standpoint, it's actually in most cases too much light that you're getting in when you have these really open glazing, like high window to wall ratios, like lots of glazing in your spaces. When you have too much light, it causes other issues. It causes visual discomfort. It's hard to see. You get glare. And so there is like a sweet spot for daylight in buildings where you want to have like a certain band of daylight coming in, and we know that that amount of daylight definitely doesn't need like floor to ceiling glazing. You can have much less glazing and still get incredible daylight in a space. And so I don't actually think that there's a contradiction in like wanting to have a lot of daylight and having energy performance. It's really being smart about how you are designing your windows or your glazing to bring in daylight in an efficient way and into the spaces where you want it the most.
So, as you described, there's a lot of nuances and a lot of different factors that go into what optimal performance means across a wide spectrum of factors. Can you talk a little bit about what challenges or difficulties you have in terms of implementation, how you help these owners, these institutions implement a sustainability strategy?
I think that cost can be obviously a factor when you are trying to design a high performance building, a sustainable building. And there are strategies related to sustainability that may cost more. However, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more. I was mentioning earlier how getting involved early in a project is where we tend to develop the goals for a project. The earlier we can get involved and integrate like sustainability into the conceptual design of a project or the early design of a project, the most cost efficient it can be, because you're if you're halfway through a project, if you're like nearing the end of the design development phase, and then you decide like, oh, we actually need to improve the energy performance of this building, it's going to cost a lot more to try to like either change out the systems or like somehow fit in, like a more efficient heating and cooling system into like this something you've already designed halfway through. If we can do that from the very beginning, I think that makes the implementation generally much much easier.
Super interesting where cost is this one big factor that is always in consideration. And I guess with policy, it does add that requirement. So it incentivizes folks to be compliant regardless of the cost if they want to get something built. But I think one thing that's really interesting that you touched upon is that the earlier you get involved, the earlier you start looking at some of these sustainability design decisions, the better performing and lower cost some of these design decisions might be. Can you talk a little bit about what are these major decisions that you've seen are most effective at the beginning of the project that kind of drives sustainability throughout the whole process?
Sure. So, okay, we were talking about daylight earlier. I can use daylight as an example. So, daylight in a building has like value in lots of different ways. Foremost, we want natural light in our buildings. Everyone likes to have natural light. They like to be able to see out a window. They like to feel the light levels change throughout the day. It reduces stress, it improves health. It's like great for people in buildings. Daylight in a building also can help with energy efficiency, because if you can bring natural light into the building, you can reduce the electric lighting loads in the building. You also have to, be careful about overheating the building. Like, you don't want too much direct sun coming in, which will cause the interiors to heat up. So it's like a balance. So daylight, while it's seemingly like a simple concept, actually can impact a lot of different aspects of how a building performs, in terms of like creating a beautiful, comfortable environment for the occupants, and also the energy, how the building operates and its energy loads. So that being said, at the beginning of a project, you can impact how daylight is coming into the building, because you're still thinking about the massing, you're thinking about orientation, you're thinking about like how much glazing you want to have. So if you ask the questions about daylight at the very early end, then there's like a fruitful conversation to have with the design team about like, well, let's like test if we orient this facade a little differently, or let's change the massing a little bit. If you're down the line in a project, the massing is established, they've like moved on, you're like in a very detailed design phase, you don't have that opportunity anymore. So you've lost the opportunity to take advantage of the daylight that can affect all these different aspects of sustainability in the building. So there is the loss of opportunity down the line. And then also you have to, not only is there loss of opportunity, but you also have to make up for sort of the reduced performance in other ways. So say you don't bring adequate daylight into your spaces, then you're going to have higher electrical lighting loads. That's going to increase your energy usage in the building. You're going to have overheating, and then because you have too much glazing, and then you're going to have to add shading or like some sort of daylight control devices, which just adds more cost to the project. So if you were able to have the conversation early on, it's almost like it makes it more cost effective, because you don't have to add the shading devices. Potentially, you don't have to add the additional or you can reduce the electrical lighting need later on. So it allows you to think about the building holistically and think about the performance holistically, versus like later trying to catch up and like be be reactive rather than proactive about like how it's performing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's why we see a lot of architecture firms even that opening up a sustainability office or a branch internally so that they can foster collaboration.
I think we talked a lot in this conversation about the building specifically, about what can happen after you have already determined the site, but you do work with some institutions who are maybe campus and or like multi-building portfolio owners. So what kind of strategies at that higher level can we do to maybe set better design standards, to maybe have a bigger impact even before the building is selected?
We do work with clients and owners who have multiple buildings. And I think you're right. We can help them to set goals before there's even a project on the table. I think it's very, it depends on the particular client and their building portfolio, to be honest. Because, for example, if you're talking about like a higher ed institution, a university, oftentimes they have like a central energy plant, and or there's infrastructure that is shared between the buildings. So if you're interested in, if they're motivated to decarbonize their entire building stock, there are ways to do that efficiently, looking at this shared infrastructure or shared resources. So thinking about sort of what is the infrastructure or resources that are being shared between all the buildings, and how can that be made better? How can that be improved? Will suddenly like bring up the performance of each individual building. So that's one thing. Additionally, I think, depending on the buildings and their program, there are certain standards that you can set to be like design goals or sustainability goals across all buildings. And again, that's kind of client specific, because like the sustainability goals for, say, a large like healthcare institution with lots of hospital buildings is going to be very different than like a university with a variety of like lab and classroom and dorm buildings. So it is sort of client specific, but understanding the program in the buildings and like what are the through lines across their whole portfolio, I think is really critical to understand, like what do these buildings all have in common, or how are they different from one another. That'll start to establish like goals that can be shared amongst the buildings. Another thing that we often do is to do benchmarking for a particular portfolio. So like, say you are an owner who has lots of different office buildings, before you can even like start to reduce energy usage, you have to understand how those buildings are operating right now. And so if you start to measure the energy use of each of those buildings, office buildings, then you can look at across your portfolio, how are you doing and how does each building compare to one another? And they're often like being run by the same facilities team or similar teams according, like with similar standards. So it's a great way to compare and then to understand, like, okay, how can we reduce energy usage across all buildings? Or maybe there's like one outlier that's consuming twice as much as the others, and then you can go and troubleshoot there and understand like what's going on in this particular building that's causing it to operate differently.
So I'm curious, Irmak, you have come from a very highly academic sustainability and resiliency backgrounds, doing a lot of research on that matter, and you're now a practitioner. What motivates you?
What motivates me is trying to make buildings better. I think, building new buildings in itself puts a greater burden on the planet. That is an inevitable thing. At the same time, in order to foster like a healthy society and to have, like spaces for people that allow them to live comfortably and in a healthy way, we need to continue to invest in our built environment. So there are these two competing factors at play. I totally recognize that we need the built environment. It's critical to our well-being as a society, but we need to make buildings better. We need to reduce their impact on the world. And I think that that's what motivates me, is trying to make spaces that are both fostering of their occupants, but then also can, tread lightly.
Thank you, Irmak. This was a wonderful conversation, mainly focused on sustainability and resiliency. I think we learned a lot, and I hope the listeners out there would at least get what sustainability means after listening to this podcast. So thank you for all the listeners. This was Most Modern. Stay tuned for our next episode.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.